Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a little quick update on the Shadowpriest. Many of you are looking to this, but as it's not really done anything to it, we left it a little while, but Blizzard hasn't done anything more to it, so let's have a quick look. As you may or may not be aware, Shadowpriests are struggling quite heavily with the Shadowlands changes, and then they made some extra changes a week or so ago in order to maybe solve some of those problems. So they adjusted a couple of spells, and they brought back Devouring Plague as a dot to the Shadowpriest toolkit. Now, unfortunately, these changes seem to have highlighted a big discussion that's been happening with the Shadowpriest is that Blizzard just isn't sure exactly what to do with it. The Shadowpriest was kind of designed originally in Legion when it brought in the Insanity mechanic with things like Surrender to Madness in mind, and also the crazy wackiness that comes with having very, very, very high amounts of haste. Since then, they've had to backtrack and pull back on that because good players were able to really take advantage of that and do absolutely incredible things. So they've constantly been in a case of trying to pull back the Insanity. And considering the spec is based around Insanity, it's led to a whole slew of issues. So one of the things they did was adjust Shadow Word Death because it made no sense. It was nice to have it back as standard, but it made no sense in what it did. So they've buffed its execute damage, all right? So in the execute phase, it will do increased damage now. However, that damage does scale quite heavily back onto you as the player. That means if it does get a decent crit, you can lose like 40% of your HP. And as damage scales much, much quicker than, say, player HP does, typically anyway, in the history of the game, then that means that you might end up in a really dangerous situation with Shadow Word Death in its current format. Certainly if you're doing content where you're taking damage. So if you are in that execute phase, but you're also taking heavy damage, Shadow Word Death might just finish you off. Now that's not something that's particularly uncommon. Certainly around the Cataclysm era of Shadow Word Death, there were several occasions if that boss should take extra damage. I'm thinking of the first boss in Bastion of Twilight. Halfus Wormbreaker was notorious for killing Shadowpriest because he took so much extra damage that Shadow Word Deathing could kill a lot of the players if they weren't properly prepared. But we're not talking about those increased damage phases here. We're just talking about normal DPS rotations. So if you need to be careful with chunking big, huge amounts of your HP with this thing. It's something they definitely want to probably keep an eye on. You don't want that to happen. Let's talk about this Devouring Plague then. Devouring Plague, the idea behind it is, from a common sense point of view, sort of works, but in actual practicality, it doesn't work. So Devouring Plague is very expensive, and the idea of it is that if you're in a situation where Void Form doesn't make any sense, you have this extra dot, cost 50 Insanity, that you can cast instead of going into your Void Form. So that would be something like open world content. So if anybody who's ever leveled a Shadow, like I did, they'll be fully aware that regularly you're just in the scenario where by the time you've generated the Insanity to actually go into Void Form, that it's pointless, and therefore you end up sort of holding back on exactly how your class works until you find a scenario where it makes some sort of sense. It's very disappointing because the whole effect of Void Form is for it to last a long time, or at least a reasonable amount of time, yet you're just not in combat long enough to actually have that make sense, and it feels very unrewarding and unsatisfying. So Devouring Plague is here, so you actually can cast this outside of Void Form and have an extra dot that you can use in those scenarios. Now, here's the problem. If Devouring Plague is really good, then you won't go into Void Form anymore. If Devouring Plague is really bad, it's pointless. Right now, it does fall into the pointless category. In fact, it does less damage if it ticks for its entire duration than a Void Bolt. So why would you ever cast this thing? It's better to use the damage of the Void Eruption, and Void Eruption does do a huge amount of damage, and then get those Void Bolts out of it, even if it's only one or so, because it's going to be more worthwhile than the Devouring Plague. But how they're going to try and make it work so it doesn't swing one way or the other is almost an impossibility from Blizzard's point of view, and I do not envy them trying to shoehorn this in without it coming across as almost laughable that they thought this was going to work. So it's a struggle for Blizzard, and not one that I envy at all. Lots of great suggestions coming out from the Shadowpriest community of what could help with Shadowpriest. This ain't it. And in fact, what this has led to is actually some awkward rotations to utilize this, because one thing Devouring Plague does do is cost a huge amount of Insanity. Now, if you've not played a Shadowpriest, that's fine, but actually entering Void Form causes your character to erupt. It's called Void Eruption, which does significant amounts of damage. It's actually one of the burstiest spells you can get. What this means is you can go into a Void Form, so you cast this big Void Eruption that AoEs everything, does huge damage, and then use this very expensive Devouring Plague to instantly drop out of Void Form. Now, Finn is trying to demonstrate as quickly as he possibly can in some of the footage in the background, but unfortunately due to lag, it kind of issues it out and you try and squeeze Void Bolts in here or there. So it's not ideal, but we are playing on US servers, and we do know this is possible from some of our US counterparts. So what you could do is say, go into, do a Void Eruption, Devouring Plague yourself immediately back out of Void Farm, and then work your way very quickly back up to Void Farm to do another quick Void Eruption, and it produces significant amounts of damage. In fact, there's a little bit of a feeling flying around here that if they don't get Shadowpriest right, they might just make it do a buttload of damage, because the gameplay is terrible. They don't want them to die, so they might just make them do a lot of damage, in which case a lot of people might feel pressured or indeed tempted to play a clunky, not workable class just to do a lot of DPS. But that's a little pie in the sky prediction for you there. I wouldn't hold that too, I wouldn't put too much stock in that if I was you. Just a little feeling we have here. This also works really well with the ability of Dark Ascension to go instantly back into Void Farm, because you can Void Farm, Devouring Plague right back out of Void Farm, go straight back into Void Farm, and do things like that, which produce these massive amounts of burst damage. Is that how this spell is intended to be used? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Overall, Shadow is just in a really bad place. And we're hoping substantial reworks are coming, but are we running out of time? Is the clock ticking too quickly on this one? I don't know. So Shadowpriest, stay tuned. If we find something interesting, if something happens, we will be the first to let you know. But as it stands right now, not particularly. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I will see you when I can tell you something more. All right? Bye-bye.